many ways their religions and cultural traditions are overlapping. Their histories at many stages have been closely intertwined, and they are in many ways the closest of all peoples in the former Yugoslavia. And yet, as I hope to show, the particularities of Montenegrin history and geography, the Montenegrin experience, the fact the existence of a clan-based society with its own value system closely related to that of neighbouring northern Albanians and of the Vlach pastoralists have made Montenegrins different. In seeking to make that case, the adherents of these two opposing views, quite often at the more extreme edges of this, you will find people who want to stress the sort of primordial, the ethnic relation of populations' Montenegranness or Serbianness. So they want to go back and somehow suggest that there are these pure concepts of identity, of nationality, of nationhood that stretch way back into the past. Now, I'm not going to go into arguments of ethnogenesis. I'm certainly not going to look at that issue, but it's just too long and complicated. And I really want to point out that this is a gross oversimplification. Identities are not primordial, nor are they set in stone. Instead, identities are, within limits, fluid, opportunistic. They evolve over time. Conceptions of nationhood are shaped by historical events, by geography, and also, most importantly, by political elites who enlist and manipulate their versions of these events to suit their own political purposes and to further their political careers. In common with many other states, Montenegro has experienced many leaders who have employed such means to achieve their ends. And the underlying ambivalence of Montenegrin identity has facilitated this task, making it easier to be manipulated when it suits the political ends of particular Montenegrin leaders. Well, in this time that I have today, I can only allude very briefly to some of the events in Montenegro's history which may help account for this fundamental ambivalence and to differentiate the experience and the population of Montenegro from that of Serbia. And at this point, I'd just like to say that one of the clear indications of this historical difference is the way in which the degree to which people in Montenegro describe themselves as being purely Montenegrin, as against mixed or more Serbian, is very geographically defined as well, so that the heart of old Montenegro around Cetinje, and this area which was the core area of Montenegro in Turkish times, the four nahije that made up this area, is where you will find people expressing most strongly their Montenegrin identity, and where you had the strongest vote in the referendum May 2006 for Montenegrin independence, and where great celebrations, which I was at, took place at that time. Taking a quick gallop, I'm afraid, through the history at this point. So following the 6th century invasions of the Slavs, the first embryonic state to emerge on the territory of modern Montenegro was Dukla, later known as Zeta. And this emerged towards the end of the 11th century, and for a period of about 80 years at this time, was able to assert its dominance over a large part of the Central Balkans, including the Serbian heartland around Novi Pazar, today's Novi Pazar, then known as Raška, as well as territory now in northern Albania. By the 12th century, however, Dukla's position as the foremost state in the Central Balkans was overtaken by that of Raška, which in the course of the 13th and early 14th centuries expanded to become the Serbian medieval empire under the Nemanjić dynasty, and which stretched from the Aegean to the Adriatic and from the Danube to Corinth. When in turn this state fell to the advancing Ottomans following defeats at battles on the Maritsa River in modern Bulgaria and at Kosmopolje, approximately this same area of territory was again to experience a brief period of independence under two local dynasties. First, the Baltici, a family whose ethnic origins appear to be mixed, Albanian, Serbian, and then the Sonojevici, who were feudal lords emanating from a part of Dukla, already known as Zeta. But really, within a short time, the Sarajevici themselves were threatened by the Ottoman advance and were forced to retreat into the mountainous hinterland above the Bay of Kotor, where on a plateau encircled by stone hills they built a monastery and they established a center at a place called Cetinje. So this area, as you probably know, was to be the heartland of Montenegro, and the bishopric established by Ivan Sarajevic in his newly built monastery was to prove the single most lasting institution and central one of the future Montenegro. It was supremely inhospitable and physically isolated, lived in by embattled tribes and clans, loosely led by their bishop, Vladika, and there they were to develop a way of life characterized by clan organization and sustained by pastoralism and by raiding neighboring territories. And this way of life resembled closely those of neighboring Albanians, but diverged significantly from the pattern of settled farming and larger towns that predominated in the lush valleys of Serbia at that time. So here you see the beginning of a difference in terms of social organization, a society, a patriarchally ordered society, the importance of the clan and transhumance and these developments, which are really a different experience from Serbia, although not a different experience from parts of Herzegovina. So when I'm saying one differentiates the Montenegrins from this time of the Serbs, I'm not trying to argue that the Montenegrins at that time recognized the implications of what they were, of what this meant. They didn't see differences in their environment and their way of life and social mores as conferring upon them any kind of separate nationhood or national identity. This is in an age before such things really had become concepts, before the 19th century development of the ideas of nationhood. And if pressed for an identity at this time, I suppose Montenegrins would be seeking identity in the clan, in the tribe, and in a more generalized way, drawing support in a commonality with the Serbs in Ottoman-ruled territories elsewhere, through opposition to Ottoman rule. In fact, if you look at sort of Montenegrin founding myths, or myths that are operative in Montenegro, you have this very strong notion coming through, repeated in books by people like Milovan Gilas, of Montenegrins tracing their origins back to the Battle of Kosovo and arguing that the best of the nobility took refuge in Montenegrin mountains, and this was a claim to be, in a way, laying a claim to be almost better than Serbs, plus Serb que les Serbs, the best of Serbs. But so in defense of their shared orthodoxy, both Serbs and Montenegrins followed a tradition that honored medieval Orthodox saints, who were at the same time medieval rulers, and they maintained at the same time, to some degree, and this developed and increased a quasi-messianic belief in the eventual restoration of a powerful Serbian state. So much so that when Danilo Petrovic, the first in a line of hereditary prince-bishops, was the point of when Danilo in the late 17th century became prince-bishop, that this institution then became hereditary as against being elected. When he assumed the role of Vladika in 1697, the title that he significantly chose for himself was Danilo, Vladika of Cetinje and warlord of the Serbian land. Now this designation is revealing. Not only does it stress Danilo's Serbness in counterpoint to the Ottomans, but it also lays claim in a grandiloquent way to the leadership of the Serb peoples. An interesting example of what Ivo Banac calls Montenegrin self-centeredness. And Banac himself argues, and I would agree with him in this, that it was this characteristic of Montenegrin self-centeredness, from which seeds of conflict, which were later to grow into divisions with the Serbs of Serbia, were to flourish, were to grow. Danilo also took another step, which was to be critical in terms of its importance for the way in which Montenegrins were to envisage their identity in the future. And this was to establish for the first time a link with Russia, which over the next 3 centuries was to provide material and spiritual succor to Montenegrins, engendering a loyalty unparalleled among other South Slavs. Clear evidence of Montenegro's pro-Russian sympathies were already apparent at the beginning of the 18th century, when Montenegrins, supported by some Highland and Herzegovinian tribes, but not by other South Slavs, rallied to Peter the Great's call to rise against the Ottomans in support of his Balkan campaign. And then in 1754, the first history of Montenegro was published in Russia as part of a campaign by the then Vladika, Vasilije, to persuade the Russians to establish a protectorate over Montenegro. And really just how pervasive the cult of Mother Russia had become in Montenegro was to be made fully apparent when in 1767 the Montenegrins accepted a bizarre impostor, Stefan the Small, Stepan Mali, as their ruler after he claimed to be Tsar Peter III, the murdered husband of the Empress Catherine. I don't know how many people are aware of this episode, but it really was a very bizarre one in Montenegro's history. And Stepan Mali became a very, really a ruthless ruler in terms of trying to stamp out the independence of different tribal groups and wanting to force a greater degree of political unity. And in parallel to this rapprochement to Russia, or the rapprochement as the Montenegrins saw it, let's say this is much more a Montenegrin perspective, the identity with Russia, than the other way around. The Russians were inclined to make use of Montenegrin loyalty and affections and sentiment when it suited them, but at more critical moments not to be there, I suppose one would say. So in parallel to this political rapprochement, the Orthodox Church in Montenegro, even though it retained a nominal association with the displaced patriarchate at Sremski Karlovsky